Hey y'all, how's it going? I'm Alex and this is History with Character. Today we're going to be working on the bustle for my historically adequate Haunted Mansion ensemble. But Alex, I hear you say, what do you mean by historically adequate? That's a great question, hypothetical viewer. Basically, I'm using patterns from Truly Victorian, which are marketed as taken from extant garments or patterns. I'm aiming for an accurate silhouette, and my materials are mostly taken from historical accounts, but there's always going to be some variation in modern weaving techniques and modern fabrics. I'm also using an electric machine for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't have the kind of time it takes to hand stitch a Victorian ensemble. Like, come on. Number two, I do have an antique machine, but it hasn't worked since the 50s, so I should probably get on seeing if I can find somebody to fix it. The accessories that I'm choosing to use are also not going to be historically accurate. Spoiler alert, guys, I'm going to be using the dreaded head necklace at some point, but it's a really cool one, so it'll be fine. I am thinking that I would not look too out of place in the 1870s, but it's not going to be entirely historically accurate, and I'm totally cool with that. I'm leaving myself plenty of room for creative license and to take artistic liberty. The Haunted Mansion, in and of itself, is not exactly known for being historically accurate, and its dark whimsy is one of the biggest reasons that I love the attraction so much. So, in order to get the big bum look from the 1870s Victorian era, you usually wear a bustle underneath the skirts. And today we're going to tackle that build, and it's really more of a build than it is a sewing project, and you'll see why as we get into it. I'm using Truly Victorian's Grand Bustle pattern TV 108 for this ensemble, and without any further ado, let's get going. So first things first, we have to floor troll it up. Here we can see that I got down on the floor with my pins and my pattern and just started setting everything in place. I'm using just a basic unbleached muslin for this because it's a foundation layer and theoretically nobody is going to see it. One thing that I did not like about the Truly Victorian pattern is that it didn't come with layout instructions, so it was kind of, I kind of had to figure out the best way to do it myself. Due to my limited floor space, I was only able to cut out a few pieces at a time. I didn't really have the chance to spread it all out and make sure it was all going to go evenly. So I often will rough cut pattern pieces and then go back in and cut around the actual pattern to get it to size. It makes it a little bit easier especially when I'm on the floor, trying to twist my wrist around. The next part was I had to mark the pattern, especially the back piece. The back piece was just covered in different marks, but here you can see I am marking the location for one of the bones. I marked on the edges of the fabric and then took my quilting ruler and rolled across. On the back, I had to mark the locations of all the bones, plus all the ruffles, plus the awkward bone 7, which you can kind of see here. It kind of goes diagonally across the back. Marking that was really, really tough, but eventually I was able to get it done. I just used a combination of tailor's chalk and a heat-sensitive pen. Now, when it came time to mark for bone 7, I tried a couple of different things. First things first was I tried a spoked wheel to poke holes in the fabric, and then a 9B graphite pencil. Unfortunately, the holes that I poked in the pattern just weren't quite wide enough, so this ended up not working. I ended up using the heat-sensitive pen to make the marks on the fabric. It worked, but it wasn't ideal. Here we go. Tonight we are working on getting all of that somehow turned into a foundation layer. Here goes nothing. Wow, that was an optimistic past Alex. So here we are just sewing down the fronts. I left about an 8-inch gap at the top for the opening, but otherwise just zipped it all the way through the machine. Next step was stitching the side fronts on. Here I did not leave that 8-inch gap. The sides don't need the opening like the front does. Okay, here's where mistake number 1 was made. See if you can guess what the issue is going to be before past Alex figures it out. Oh, there it goes. Looks like Alex figured out that she did not pay close enough attention to her bobbin, so let's wind up another bobbin. This project took, I think, 4 bobbins overall. It was pretty intense. Okay, now we're just gonna stitch up the side fronts again with an actual full bobbin this time. And, you know, people say I don't press my seams, but here's evidence that I do. I even use steam on it most of the time. I pressed them open, and here is where mistake number 2 was made. Hey, Alex, what are you planning to do with those seams now that they've been pressed open? Yeah, I didn't think so. The way the back is cut, you actually cut a small dart into the top part of the back. To do is stitch that down to give the back part of its shape. I choose to stitch from the point of the dart out and then go back and tie off the long ends of thread. Stitching very carefully here because I want to make sure that I don't mess up. Next up, I had to pin the boning casing. The pattern called for 1-inch wide bias tape. I didn't like that. I didn't feel like that would be strong enough. I went with 1-inch twill tape instead. I feel like the bias tape would have stretched out and not held its shape as well as the twill tape does. My only regret here is that the twill tape doesn't bend as well as the bias tape would have, so the first 2 bones were a little bit difficult to sew on. And then back under the machine, just stitching along. I stitched about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the bias tape. If that, I stitched very, very close to the edge, just to give myself plenty of room inside of those bone casings. Oh hey, Alex, you finally went back and finished some of those seams right there, except it's just the one, and it's one that kinda doesn't matter. But, you know, points for trying. This is just the dart edges. I didn't want them to fray under the stress of the boning casings and bones. So I, real quick, just felt that down by machine because it's a foundation garment. My big theme here was, this is a foundation garment, so it really doesn't matter if the top stitching is seen because nobody's going to see it. It's not that important in the grand scheme of things. And we're back to stitching on twill tape. Believe me, this was about as much fun as I'm making it sound. I just plugged in a podcast and got to work. Okay, so here's the thing. I hate this thing. It is the bane of my existence. But I have a lot of ruffles that need to be ruffled, and it's going to be a lot easier if I can figure out how this thing works. So, I'm going to finish putting on the twill tape, and then I'm going to play with this and see if I can make it work. Because I really don't want to do all those ruffles without this. Well, that wasn't foreshadowing at all. Then I had to stitch on bone 7. Bone 7 was really weird because it goes diagonally and it actually intersects with some other bone casings. So when I pinned it on, I marked with the pins where to stop my stitching so that I wouldn't accidentally cut off the other bone casing that it went over. This was kind of confusing, but I got it to work. I just had to be very, very careful when I was stitching these parts on so that I didn't cover that other bone casing underneath. Once I got to the far end, I stopped my stitching and stitched all the way back, again being careful not to sew through that second boning channel. This was to allow it to actually stick out of one end of the boning channel and curve around. This was the bone that kind of provides the support to hold the other bones out. And finally, for the 7th bone, you take a little 2 to 3 inch piece of twill tape, fold it down, and actually stitch it to the wrong side of the top bone. This is to give the 7th bone a place to go when it makes that curve around and holds it up. One thing that I found interesting in the construction of this bustle is that the majority of the bones are actually on the right side of the garment and they're just covered by the ruffles. Bone 7 was unique in that it went on the wrong side of the garment, and part of it was actually sewn to the bone casing for the top bone. So now I'm definitely not procrastinating and not wanting to play with that ruffler foot by sewing all the ruffles together. Basically, you cut out 8 of a very long rectangle, stitched them together at the short sides, and then ruffled along the top. All of this handling did wrinkle my fabric some, and I needed to iron down those seams, so I spent probably a good half hour just ironing everything down. Then I needed to hem the ruffles. I made this hem pretty much by eye and as small as I could on the machine. It didn't really matter. I just wanted these edges to be finished off. I don't actually think the instructions ever actually tell you to hem, but this was going to be so much easier. And finally, I decided to get the ruffle foot out and actually play around with it like I said I would. Here I didn't load it correctly. As you can see, the little kick plate is not actually pushing the fabric. So I figured out how to do it. That kick plate is so tight, it makes it very difficult to get the fabric underneath it to actually be able to sew. And this was one of the few attempts that I actually got it to do what it was supposed to do. These things are so cool to watch, but they're such a pain to deal with. The ruffle foot kept locking up my machine. Okay, so I give up. The ruffle foot is would be so helpful in this situation, but I just cannot get it to work. I have done everything that I can think of. So I'm just going to go back to the normal hand gathering situation, which I don't know if I've mentioned this before. I hate ruffling. Like, they're so pretty. They're so hard to do, and I don't want to. I just. So, I'm gonna spend some time today ruffling all of this by hand. I got started on it last night, but it was like 1 in the morning, so I didn't film. And we'll see how it goes. It's Sunday, so Abby just updated a new video, or uploaded a new video, and so did Nicole. So I'm gonna spend some time watching them, and I might be running D&D later today, so you know, that'll be fun. But I can probably get some extra ruffles done during that. But the ruffle foot has not defeated me. I will be trying again. I just don't have time for it right now. I'm trying to get this out by the end of March, and with me knowing that video editing takes forever, I'm just gonna give up on it for now and come back to it in a later project. And so I ended up just gathering everything by hand. I went in with my machine and put in a long straight stitch and just gathered everything down. The instructions did say that it was about a 2-to-1 ruffle, so I gathered everything to about half of its original size and then pinned it on where the pattern told me to do. And I had to be very careful because most of the ruffles went over or on top of the boning channels, so they wouldn't actually, the stitching wouldn't actually close up the boning channels, but I still had to be careful with this second ruffle because it did go over boning channel 7. And if I stitched all the way across, then I wouldn't be able to get my bone into that boning channel. So then it was just a matter of stitching all of the ruffles down. This was pretty simple, just zip it through the machine. There was a piece on there called the back brace, and it is shorter than the back is wide, so I hemmed the top and bottom of that and then stitched it to the back. This helped create the big curve of the bustle and forces the bones into the curved shape that they need to be in for their final configuration. So I stitched on the back brace to the back, which was a huge pain. I'm going through like 6 layers of fabric in certain places because of the ruffles, and my machine did not like it, but we eventually got it taken care of. And then it was just a matter of stitching the front and back sections down. I would catch all of the ruffles in the seam to make it a little bit easier later without having to finish all of those ruffle edges. Again, my machine really hated this step. now we had to put in the 2 bones that actually go around the base of the skirt. These bones are actually full circles, and one sits a few inches above the hem and one sits inside of the hem. And here's where mistake number 3 began to be made. Let's see if you can figure out where I made this mistake. I'll give you a hint. My spatial awareness is not great. Finally had to stitch down the hem. The instructions actually say that you fold over a 1/2 inch and then another inch on top of that to create a 1 inch bone casing at the very, very base of the hem. I also found some trailing threads, so went ahead and clipped those to keep things nice and neat. And here we can see yet another mistake. This is mistake number 4 for those of you keeping track at home. Hey Alex, how are you going to finish those seams? The bottommost ruffle does not get put in until the last bone casing is put in. This is because it makes it a lot easier to get to it when you need to stitch everything down. The ruffle actually overlaps certain parts, and it's just a lot easier to do it after all of the boning casing is in than before. To get all of the pleats to fit into the waistband, I just had to pleat it up. I did all of this by eye, figured out how far it needed to go. These are actually really, really tiny pleats, but they had to be pleated down. I was so overdoing gathers because that was the other option, and no. So I went with pleats instead. Then the waistband gets tacked down. Apparently I did not get on the first side of the waistband, and I'm very sorry about that. But because this is a foundation garment and theoretically won't be seen, I didn't feel bad doing machine stitching for both sides. Normally I would machine stitch the first side and then hand stitch the other, but it's a foundation layer. Hooks and eyes. Like most people on the internet, I hate doing hooks and eyes, but these weren't too bad. I sat down in front of my computer, was probably watching some outside Xbox or something like that, and just took maybe a half hour to stitch the hooks and eyes into place on the waistband. These are size 2 silver hooks and eyes. Then I realized that I needed to go back and finish all of those seams that I left unfinished earlier. The seams holding the back brace, ruffles, front and back seams needed pinking because any other method was going to add way too much bulk to that area. So I used these really old pinking shears and pinked it down. Then I set all of that stuff in the washer and took my dog for a walk. He's such a happy boy. Not yours. Can you tell I used to work with kids? So I forgot how bad muslin crinkles when you wash it, so I'm about to toss it under the iron, and hopefully that'll fix all of this, but I was planning on putting the bones in and wanted to wash it to get rid of the chalk and pen marks, which it looks like it did absolutely beautifully, but yikes. So for those of you counting, that was mistake number 5. When I actually washed this, I forgot to pre-wash and pre-shrink my fabric, and it actually shrank a little bit, which made putting the boning in an absolute nightmare because it's maybe a 1/4 inch shorter than it's actually supposed to be, which led to bones actually breaking through seams, which I had to go in and hand stitch back together. One of the bones I cannot get in. I had to cut a new piece of boning for that particular bone, and considering that I bought boning specifically for this project, I'm very upset with myself for making such a beginner error. Everything still works, but it doesn't look nearly as nice as it did before it went into the washer. Once I got the bones in place, I just had to stitch them closed using 2 or 3 whip stitches. I probably could have done back stitches, but it was kind of a huge pain. And you can see just underneath my hand what happened if I moved the bustle the wrong way, that the boning would actually kind of spring out, and then I had to shove it back into place and stitch it closed, which actually led to breaking another seam, which I do not have any footage of me fixing. But just know that I had to, and it was a huge pain. Then I got to hang it up on my dress form and insert the bottom 2 bones. Again, because it shrank a little bit, the bones are actually much bigger than they need to be here. So there's kind of a weird poking out situation where the 2 bones overlap on the final garment. No, I am not sponsored by Disney. I just really like their spirit jerseys. I will say though, inserting boning into boning casing, especially long bones like this, so satisfying. Once all of the bones were put in, I just had to do a couple of final little stitches at the hem to hold that last bone in place, and that was it. The bustle was done. Also, that weird white thing in the view, yeah, that's my tripod. That's why some of my shots get a little bit shaky, is because the tripod is not great. So, there we go. That was the process of making my historically adequate Victorian bustle for my Haunted Mansion ensemble project. I have to admit, I'm a little disappointed in it. Everything was going great, and then I washed it, and that was a rookie error. I should have remembered to wash the fabric before I started sewing, but when you have a roll of 20 yards of fabric, it's difficult to wash, and so I just thought I would be cutting off chunks and then washing it and then sewing it, and that just didn't happen. So overall, I'm okay with it. I guess it'll work. I'm really debating on whether I want to just remake it off camera. Filming it was a little more difficult just because when I'm sewing, I kind of get into a meditative state, and remembering, oh, hey, I need to stop and film for this video is a little more difficult than I really thought it was going to be. It doesn't help that I'm filming on my phone, so I have to remember to set that up, stop my podcast, start the camera, get everything set up. So overall, It'll do, but I feel like it's important to make sure that you see my failures as well as my successes. Sometimes I think it can be a little difficult to get into historical costuming because all you see on YouTube are success after success after success. And we make mistakes too. And I think that's important to remember. So I did get the shipping notification that the fabric for my petticoat is on the way. So that'll be here in just a couple of days and I can get started on that. I have some of the most gorgeous lace I have ever seen that will be going into that petticoat as insertion lace and edging lace, and I am so excited. I cannot wait. So until then, stay safe, y'all.